As you know, our topic this evening is United States relations in the Middle East since 9/11, the way forward. And our guest is Dr. John Duke Anthony, who's the President and CEO of the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations. As all of you know, 9/11 was indeed the Pearl Harbor for the U.S. Al-Qaeda war, and it was indeed a wake-up for the fact of American vulnerability and the vulnerability of many nations to acts of great violence, including weapons of mass destruction, by very small groups. Those two enormous problems demand strategies which are of some complexity and which are urgent and which will be very long-term, and which to a large extent do revolve about the countries of the Gulf area. And there are very few Americans, if any, who bring the expertise on the Gulf area and the Middle East and the Islamic world in general, as does Dr. Anthony. Let me, confronted with the dilemma of giving fair attention to Dr. Anthony's distinguished career on one hand and benefiting as much as possible from his wisdom, I'll try to make the first part of that short to allow more time for the presentation. In brief, Dr. Anthony is a graduate of VMI with a degree in history, or an emphasis in history. He received his Bachelor of Science degree in Foreign Service from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. His PhD is in International Relations and Middle East Studies from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington. He's written 3 books, over 100 articles and monographs focusing upon the Gulf, the Middle East, and the Islamic world. Perhaps the best known of those works is Arab States of the Lower Gulf, People, Politics, and Petroleum. He's participated in many of the studies of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, again emphasizing the Gulf area and the Islamic world. He, I think of interest and importance, the only non-Arab invited to be a part of all of the international observers for elections in Yemen. He's the only non-Arab to be invited to all of the meetings of the Gulf Cooperation Council's Heads of States Summits since 1981, its inception. For 25 years, he's been a regular lecturer at the Department of State and Defense, and more recently, I know he's briefed all of our ambassadors in the region, and he, on a weekly basis, meets with people at State and Defense. He's had a decade of teaching courses at Johns Hopkins. He's been a visiting and adjunct professor at the Defense Intelligence College, the Woodrow Wilson School of Government and Administration at Foreign Affairs, University of Virginia, at the University of Pennsylvania, at the University of Texas, and the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. Also, though, I think it's important to note that in the pursuit of better understanding between the United States and the Arab world, he's been instrumental as a founder in the creation of a number of organizations of great importance nationally. First, of course, the organization which he presently serves as president of, that is the National Council for U.S.-Arab Relations. He also has been a founder of the Middle East Educational Trust, the Commission on Israel-Palestinian Peace, the Society for Gulf Arab Studies, the Commission for the 14th Centennial of Islam, and he's also was a founder of the U.S. Morocco Affairs Council, as well as other organizations for which he's received several awards of great distinction, including a Distinguished Service Award from the Department of State, the Stevens Award for contributing to Arab-American understanding, and he was knighted by the King of Morocco himself for distinguished service toward Arab-U.S. relations. The topic we have tonight is, as you all know, as important as anything is in current American foreign policy for now and for the foreseeable future. We're very fortunate to have one of the nation's truly serious students of the region and one of its most recognized authorities. It's my great pleasure to present to you Dr. John Duke Anthony.
Thank you, Dr. Byrd. Mr. Lloyd Carpenter, Vice President for International Relations of Northrop Grumman and the head of the Board of Trustees of this outstanding Council on Foreign Affairs. Of the 96 councils in the National Council for World Affairs Organizations, I've been involved with 66 over the last 20 years in one form or another. But I want to say to you that yours is in the top 4. Tonight it's the top 1. I mean this. This is an extraordinary city, an extraordinary community of civic activists and people who are interested in trying to prove our relations with the world beyond our shores. And not just interested, but going beyond their interests to their activism. This city is one of a kind in our country, in the Western world, and in international trade, investment, finance, joint commercial ventures, and also to a greater extent than many Americans are aware, in the cause of peace. I've been asked to focus on an issue that I know is of immense interest to many of you, and for some, understandably, on the 3rd-month anniversary of one of the greatest tragedies in our history. There must be pain in many people's hearts. And I hope that none of you lost loved ones, family, or friends in that particular tragedy. But as in the case with so many, if not all, tragedies, good can come. And while each individual's emotions are rubbed raw, and like a river that has raged and not reached its destination, all of us will process our pain, our angst, our confusion, and uncertainty about the question of why and even whether it need ever have occurred from any militant, fanatical, extremist perspective. I've been asked to focus on the nature and extent of our relations and interest in the region since 9/11, and I will try to do so, and I would do so hopefully from a methodical perspective of trying to help all of us organize data, insight, context, background, and perspective so that we might leave here at least with a way to build on such knowledge and understanding, information and insight and perspective that may come in our discussion this evening, and use it as a foundation for further study, reading, and debate. And our relations and interests can be addressed in a context of categories. And they can also be addressed in the context of values that we assign to our interests and needs and concerns in these categories. Many people try to silence another or score points in the debate by saying that's not in our interest, or what would be our interest in that. And so not all interests are the same in terms of what we would do regarding putting our shoulders to the wheel and rolling our sleeves up to make something happen, or to prevent something happening, or to ameliorate something that's problematic, or to render something more manageable. I would submit that we can categorize our interests in the following 6 categories in descending order of their magnitude or complexity and importance. And this is not arbitrary. I've been doing this since the mid-1960s. This is, by the way, my 38th year of being in a university from which there's no possible graduation, trying to make sense and understanding of the region. Only on the best of the days do I get it incomplete. But starting in 1963, it's been nonstop till now. And I don't have it all figured out, and I hope none of your speakers imply that they do. These are the following. We have a set of strategic interests, economic interest, political interest, commercial interest, defense interest, and then a sixth one would be under the rubric of democracy, human rights, civil rights. Since the mid-1960s, I have made it a practice every 2 years to sound out about 20 to 25 of our decision makers, policy makers, opinion formulators, analysts in the intelligence fields, defense, state, commerce, treasury, and the Congress, to ask them without prejudgment what are our interests. And so these 6 categories have come from this empirical examination. There's nothing theoretical about it. I'm not borrowing it from somebody or making it up. And we only use the word vital regarding these interests from around 74 until now. We never used it once before, although the British and the French did. Kissinger and former Secretary of Defense and CIA and Energy, James Schlesinger, were the first to say we had vital interest in this region. But let me run through them at a gallop and then come back under a greater microscopic focus to zero in on the ones that are most problematic, implicit and laced with challenge and some degree of uncertainty. The first, in terms of the strategic interests, these are grand strategic interests that are so obvious that we too seldomly enunciate them or focus on them at the appropriate length that they deserve. These are the interest of war and peace, preventing the former, enhancing, securing, achieving the latter. And if we find ourselves in the former, though we tried to have a system of deterrence and defense to ward it off, and we found ourselves in war, then to win that war. These could not be more obvious, but this is a region that has been wrecked and racked with war and the absence of peace for all of the last half century. Not every day, but too many days. We're talking about the things that feed war, feed peace, or bring about the absence of one and the uncertainty of the other. And these have to do with cross-border forays, invasions and occupations, the naked, blatant ones of Iraq into Kuwait on August the 2nd, 1990, if you need an example. The ones in election week of 1956, when the British, the French, and the Israelis invaded Egypt, or in 1973, when the Egyptians crossed the Bar-Lev line and attacked the Israeli forces in the Sinai, or Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. And you could go on with the list. But we are also talking about events, incidents, actions that would trigger a war, or certainly trigger mobilization and deployment. And this is the one part of the planet in the last 15 years that we have mobilized and deployed more of our troops and expended more of our treasure than any other single place in the world. Both times before we did it, we thought we had it right. We thought we had the right fix in the mix in terms of deterrence and defense. We were wrong both occasions. And my humility would underscore that we don't have it right for the present on the period, or the period in front of us either. But we're talking about the triggering actions, such as the closure of the Suez Canal, vital as it is to the strategic lines of communication, or the Hormuz Strait, which lies between Oman and Iran. And most Americans believe that the straits lie in Iran's territory, and this was certainly the justification for our arming the Shah to the degree that we did in the 60s and the 70s, but the totality of the straits are in Oman's water. Every ship going in and every ship going out, not one of them go through Iran's waters on a regular basis there. That one's 22 miles across. And then there's another one that's really more perilously perched, and that is the so-called Bab el-Mandeb, or the Gate of Tears, at the southern end of the Red Sea, which at some points is only 7 miles across. But that's Israel's gateway to East Africa and South Asia. That's along the strategic east-west and west-east lines of communication. And of course, the British were there forever and a day, having their only crown colony in the whole region. But we're talking also about the seizure of the region's energy resources, being the oil and the gas, the hydrocarbon resources, refineries, pipelines, terminals, shipping lanes, through sabotage or explosion, or in the case of Kuwait, the 732 wells that were put on fire. I was on the first civilian plane into Kuwait upon its liberation, and can recall as vividly as anything in my life the horrors and the ravages wreaked upon that tiny defenseless country. And I can also recall your city's role in working with Governor Schaefer to dedicate one of the piers here in Baltimore for the resupply and the restoration, resurrection of Kuwait, and working with some 48 physicians at Johns Hopkins Medical School here who went to Kuwait shortly after to ascertain the degree of trauma amongst Kuwaiti youth, and found that 1/3 indeed were into trauma. Secondly, on the economic interest, these have to be definitionally somewhat precise, because in the 60s, people rolled economic, commercial, financial, investment, business, trade, technology, cooperation, all under an economic rubric. It's no longer been that way for the last 20 years. The economic interest is a more naked, simplistic, direct one of sheer access to the region's energy resources. Of course, the issues of supply and security of supply are important. Of course, the issues of levels of production are important. Of course, the issues of price are important. But the rock bottom economic interest is the sheer access to it, because we're the single largest consumers of this depletable commodity in the world, the single largest importers of this in the world, the single largest wasters of this in the world, and the single largest crybabies in terms of our relationship with it, a relationship that most countries in the world would trade places with us in a millisecond and give us their terms of trade with it. And people would say, well, the price does have to be linked to it. And yet it doesn't. If you're an ambulance driver for a hospital around here, people don't say when 911 is dialed that, well, the price is too high and I need to wait a few days. Hold on if you can, I'll come in next Wednesday. And we don't do that for our allies where Israel, Egypt, Morocco, Taiwan, some country to ask us to come to their aid, we wouldn't say, well, the price is too high. As to how high it could go, who knows? But I know one frame of reference, and that would be $220 a barrel, that we'd pay it without flinching. Why is that my frame of reference? Because for 10 years, during the Lebanese Civil War, the ambulance drivers for the American University of Beirut, which never ever shut, by the way, if an institution warrants the Nobel Prize for Peace, it would be that one. They paid every single day $220 a barrel, rather than tell people they couldn't come. So that gives you a frame of reference of what we would do if we had to. The third aspect, the political interest that we have, are not so much, although people can debate this, to intrude, intervene in someone else's society in terms of how they have their people participate in the national development process, or constitutions, parliaments, elections, suffrage, and the like. It's the nature of the policy beyond their boundaries, their borders, their foreign policy, if you will. And we have been in a different ballgame now for the last 30 years, because almost all the peoples in the region are independent. And we cannot act as, say, the French did or the British did for so long by fiat in ultimatums and expect to proceed. Most of the peoples of the region are indeed free, have exercised their self-determination. The exceptions, of course, are the Palestinians in the occupied territories of Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem. Also those in the southern Sahara of Morocco, as well as a tiny sliver remaining of Lebanon, and a more substantial area in the Golan province of Syria. But for most of the other occasions, in pursuit of one's needs, concerns, and interests, it has to be through the give and take of dialogue, sacrifice, compromise, deliberations, meetings, commissions, and the like. I'll come back to that because this is where our greatest challenge lies, both before and leading up to 9/11, and certainly in the wake and the aftermath of 9/11 and for the period immediately in front of us and for as far ahead as I can see. The fourth interest, the commercial one, includes the financial ones in terms of investment, and here we're talking about trade and imports and exports of goods and services and investments and monetary instruments and fiscal and monetary policies and the extension of production lines of the United States, the fact that there is $1.3 trillion of just the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf countries invested in the United States economy, and how that relates to extending production lines, lowering per unit production cost, augmenting state, local, and federal tax revenues, providing the source for propellants in millions of American vehicles, cooling and warming tens of thousands of American factories, and being the central engine that drives not only our economy, but the economies, rich and poor, big and old, small and new, of most of humanity's countries' economies. We're talking also, though, about something that most Americans are not aware, and that is this particular commodity of which the region has some abundance, namely hydrocarbon resources. Upwards of 70% of every drop of oil that has thus far been discovered is in this particular region, whereas we have less than 3% of it. It is denominated, believe it or not, in our currency. You can make a case that Kuwait should charge its own currency, Kuwaiti dinars, or Saudi Arabian should charge Saudi Arabian riyals, but they all charge Uncle Sam's and Aunt Samantha's currency, which is a great benefit to us. It has a lot to do with the acceptability, respectability, and of the American dollar and the ongoing preeminence of the American financial system worldwide. And it is a source of considerable jealousy and envy, and at times anger on the part of the French, the British, the Japanese, the Dutch, the Italians, and all the others there. But because you have institutions here like T. Rowe Pratt and a whole lot of others, they're quite well aware of this, and we do not want them to change. I point this out because so many think that the region is important only because of energy. And of course, energy would be at the top of anybody's particular list, but there are many, many other benefits, dimensions from which we derive some considerable gain and advantage from our relationship. We come as well under the commercial one to the point that this is one of the few regions that we trade with in the world where we often have a surplus in terms of our trade, which is not the case with regard to Europe, Latin America, Asia, South Africa, South Asia, Central Asia, or Southeast Asia. We come then to the defense aspect, and you might wonder, well, why is it so far down on the list? And it is down on the list because even the defense people want it down on the list. You don't want to use it unless you have to. It's a last resort thing. George Meany used to boast that he'd never participated in a strike in his life in all the years that he was the head of the AFL-CIO. And he thought, well, once you participate in a strike, then you have used your most important arrow in your quiver, or your strong card in your deck, and then the situation can very easily spiral out of control. So he was quite proud of never using it. And in my work with General Zenny, Tommy Franks, General P before, I've worked with almost every single one of our commanders-in-chief from the beginning of the founding of the United States Central Command, our largest force in the region in its area of responsibility, Schwarzkopf before too. I have never met one of them that was eager to use force under any circumstances in the region. They were far more dovish than many of the civilian, most of the civilian hawks that I have met in a Pentagon, State Department, NSC, and elsewhere. But the defense relationships come down to the nitty-gritty of, let's say, a forward position. I'm careful in trying not to use the word base because If you call it a base, then the country that provides the base is almost certain to be drummed out of 2 or 3 regional organizations that are important to us, though we're not members. Lots of our friends are members, and they carry water for us. So we have to be quite inventive and use the English majors at Johns Hopkins and other places. In Bahrain, for example, we don't have a base. We have an administrative support unit in Bahrain. And if the purpose of a base is to be there all the time, well, we don't have that in Bahrain, but we have unlimited days use of the facilities of that administrative support unit. So the English majors get good grades on that one. We have defense understandings, defense undertaking. We have 5 defense cooperation agreements, all but Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia in the case of the Gulf. And 4 of those 5 came after the liberation of Kuwait. The oldest one is with the Sultanate of Oman. Northrop Grumman is part and parcel of the administration and the overall atmospherics and the background and the context and much of the training and the technology and the managerial input and comment and effort to contribute to deterrence, and should deterrence fail, then to people's defense capabilities in the region. Further afield, on Diego Garcia and Gan, 2 islands in the Indian Ocean that once belonged to the British. We have a presence there. And we have understandings with Bahrain in particular. We have prepositioned equipment in Kuwait, prepositioned equipment in Qatar, prepositioned equipment in Oman, and some prepositioned equipment in Saudi Arabia as well. Plus intelligence exchange, information sharing, the international military education and training programs here, regular exercises and visits to the U.S. Central Command's headquarters in MacDill, Florida. And the last of these interests, as I mentioned, would include democracy, human rights, civil rights, women's rights, support for the English language. Used to have one of trying to have people wedded to weight specifications, and also to allow an opportunity for the Peace Corps. But it's not my cynicism alone or so much as it is almost a unanimous chorus of those with whom I speak, that these are, let's say, psychologically or ideologically indulgible, but politically expendable. That is to say, it's hard for me to cite for you an incident where we have rolled up our sleeves, mobilized, and really made or broken a relationship in terms of whether the country was democratic or going in a democratic direction, or was politically pluralistic, or the like. Although we probably have spent and spilt more ink on that particular perceived interest than all the others that I've mentioned so far. And let's go back through them for a quick gallop here. The strategic ones have been successful since 1973, with 3 exceptions. The invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the 73 war there, but the Iran-Iraq War, 8 years, 1980 to 1988, and the Kuwait crisis of 1990-91, 7 months there. Unless you want to count the one that we're in at the present time, which is a little bit more slippery definitionally as well as geographically, because Afghanistan and Pakistan are for many people regarded as being in South Asia. Although I'm comfortable putting them under the more liberal, loosely defined Middle East. And so this would be where I would put that one at the present time. Let's look at it from a point of view of the things that I mentioned that would provoke war. The Suez Canal has been opened now. It's been shut twice, 56, and then for nearly 7 years, 8 years almost, after the June 67 war, but it has not been shut since, and we have not been stopped in our usage of it, which is something to bear in mind with much of the media bashing of Egypt these days in terms of what Egypt brings to the table and we get out of our relationships with Egypt. I'll come to that again in a minute. There hasn't been sabotage or explosions or terminals being blown up or the straits being closed. So we have largely been successful in our strategic interest for most of the years of our presence and ongoing engagement. With regard to the economic aspects, likewise, not since March the 13th, 1974, has there been an oil embargo on the United States, or for that matter, any other country, which is rather remarkable, given the controversies and the degree of emotionality and the stridency and shrillness and vitriol and vehemence of many pronouncements of radical political leaders. That has not occurred now for more than a quarter of a century. We come to the political aspects, and as I said, this is where our greatest challenge resides. Let me list them in no necessary sequence or order, but just to show you how considerable our work is in front of us here. One political feeling from one end of the region to the other is that for all of our pontification, from time to time pomposity and moralizing, we don't nearly say what we mean or mean what we say as much as perhaps we think we say what we mean and mean what we say. And so there's not, at least I've not been able to detect a single individual anywhere in the region who, as much of the media would have one believe, is against our values and our systems and our success and our wealth and our openness and freedom. I have not met one single human being who's ever had any aspect of that in her or his conversation as to their difficulties with Aunt Samantha and Uncle Sam's policies here. A second one would be that while we are upset, and understandably and rightly so, with how we are increasingly portrayed, Freudian slip, in the textbooks and in the media in the region, the response from one end of the region to the other would be, well, you taught us how. We have watched your movies for 50 years. We have never once seen a good Arab or a good Muslim in any of your movies. In fact, we've never even seen a neutral one, an okay one. We are institutionalized, ritualized, routinized, seen as the other, as them, as those. So quantitatively and qualitatively, you're the Olympic champion on that front. Yes, ours is bubbling up, it's brimming over the surface, but it's a relatively recent phenomenon, because prior to 1947, from Morocco to Muscat, Baghdad to Berber, Algiers to Aden, you had not one enemy in the entire region. We would go further and say you didn't even have an adversary, not one critic in the entire region. That was the nature and the extent of American goodwill from one corner to the other. Not that it's all been vitiated and drained, but it has dwindled substantially. And the one reason, well, actually there are four reasons, and the four are the ones that we've been reading about, but they're not all the same by any means. From the bin Laden crowd, it's the American presence in Saudi Arabia, the defense, the military, the forwardly engaged deployed force there. It's also the pain of the policies of the sanctions against Iraq for its non-fulfillment of about a dozen demands laid upon it by the UN Security Council for its rape, invasion, and occupation of Kuwait. It is also a perceived double standard by the United States, where we bend every elbow and insist on every call being returned with regard to, say, Iraq and Sudan and some others complying with UN sanctions. But a larger number of UN Security Council resolutions towards Israel have gone unfulfilled, even those that the United States itself voted for. So this is thrown up in our face as well. And the single oldest or longest, single largest and single most pervasive of all of the pain and the disappointment and angst of those who in 1947 thought we were bereft of blemish in such moral and political leadership and visionary, courageous stance, is the U.S. policy and position, actions and attitudes, and inaction, and the question of the ongoing Israeli occupation of the occupied territories of the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, which is now into its 34th year, one of the longest occupations in recent memory. And a fourth would be the selective targeting, not so much by a government, although there is a governmental aspect to it, and it's one I understand and largely support, of targeting, fixating on loopholes and those who have abused and exploited our immigration laws and overstayed their visas and come here under false pretenses or said an untruth at BWI when they were talking to the customs officials, and have been here to engage in bringing harm to our country, our values, our institutions, our principles. But many who have studied also the records of the Office of Counterterrorism would point out that up until 9/11, the Middle East was the least involved in this. That is to say, the record published for 2000, which showed some 200 incidents of terrorism in the world, put around 180 of those in Latin America, and a larger number in Africa, Asia, and Europe than in the Middle East. Facts are facts. Facts are stubborn things. They have implications for knowledge and understanding and policies and positions. Of course, it changed dramatically, numerically, on 9/11, and with the ongoing intifada, the uprising by the Palestinians against the Israeli occupation, the numbers continued to mount each day. But a fifth aspect in this regard is whose defining a terrorist? That two people who became prime ministers of Israel were involved in the blowing up of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem with massive loss of life. And to this day, they are regarded in Israel as freedom fighters there. I know the Syrians and the Egyptians in particular have tried to get us to meet with them and others to agree on a definition of terrorism, but we have consistently refused to attend any such conference that would focus on that. And so we've halted for that. In terms of our role in the UN Security Council, we talk a lot about democracy and the like, and yet most in the region would say we're not, just as we would say they're not. And that point would be a literal one here, that neither are we democratic nor are they democratic, and no country is democratic, has been democratic, and none is likely to become democratic. They're using the word demos and krasis in the Greek roots of it precisely here. So one can say, if you adopt that perspective, that all countries are undemocratic. Some are more undemocratic than others, or some are less undemocratic than others, if you see the glasses half full or half empty. But we do talk a lot about democracy, even though we're not one. We are a republic governed by division of power between the executive, judicial, and legislative branch, and ruled by a system of laws. And yet in the UN Security Council, the largest political body to which we belong anywhere in the world, we're seen as the Olympic champion of using the veto to thwart the democratic process there. More than any other, all countries in the UN Security Council together. We've used it 72 times since 1970. 42 of the 72 times have been used to prevent a castigation or an admonition of Israel by the French, the British, and other members of the Council. Now I'll stop here because this is at 40 minutes, as we said, and you were punctual and timely to begin. And I thought I would lay out these 5 or 6 categories of our interest. We still have them all. We're still working on them all. And we have been actually far more successful in most of them than many people would acknowledge. And our greatest work is in the area of our political challenges. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for having me. My 4th time coming to be with you. I look forward to your questions.
We thank you very much. Dr. Anthony will recognize you and repeat the questions.
How mistaken was it for the United Nations or the United States and the Allied coalition to stop and not continue on to Baghdad to topple Saddam Hussein? Monday morning quarterbacking rearview mirror is always rather clear, but at the time it wasn't so clear, and I think we did the right thing at the right time, at the right reason, for the right people's interest. Although I'm bothered by the fact that the fellow is still there. But at the same time, many are bothered that someone else is still there 90 miles off the southern coast of Florida. And he still plays softball, tugs at that fatigue cap, and smokes those cigars 40 years after we've said he's got to go. The Ayatollah Khomeini, old whiskers there, we were the people that he loved to hate the most, and he was maybe the one that many Americans loved to hate the most, but he died in his sleep. Emperor Hirohito at the end of World War II, even when he finally did die, most British refused to go to his funeral there because the hatred and the feeling of despicability. So that more than a few, and I've just ticked off a few that may outlast a lot of us in this room. We used to laugh and giggle and tee-hee and toast each other when people said, well, he'll outlast Bush the senior. But he outlasted 2 terms of Clinton, and we're well into the son now. And maybe the sins of the father visited upon the sons here. We didn't go, we couldn't go, we shouldn't go, and we did the right thing in not doing that at the time. We would have been alone with the remote possibility of the British being with us. We had no one else, and even the British were not sure there. Secondly, September the 6th, 1990, my wife and I watched a press conference, I think it was in Helsinki, between Bush the senior and Gorbachev, and both of them took all questions, and they both said to millions watching that we will do what we will do in accordance only with the resolutions of the United Nations Security Council. And so both, in effect, tied their hands behind their back on that front. There was never any resolution that was any more hawkish or forceful than to liberate Kuwait. There was no resolution that would have allowed us to continue on to Baghdad. Fourthly, had we done so in spite of that, having so many tens, if not hundreds of millions of people watched that 3 hours and a half press conference there that my wife and I watched, the next time we would have said we will do this, that, and the other through the UN would have haunted us there. And people say, yes, we've heard that before. And so our credibility wouldn't have been enhanced. Sixthly, the number of Americans who know Iraq inside out, the dramatic persona, the information gatherers, the intelligence people, the personalities, the elites, are fewer than 6 in our country. And that sounds like a typographical error, and I wish it were, but it's a scandalous aspect of our training, our preparation, our anthropological, sociological skills. We had around 50,000 Americans in Iran at one time. We're not bereft of human resources and intelligence resources in Iran, but in Iraq we certainly are. Seventhly, many analysts even now believe that it would have required a prolonged occupation of Iraq. And there certainly wasn't any American public policy support or attitude in favor of an American occupation of Iraq. So I don't think we did the wrong thing. I think we did the right thing. It was a tough call there, and we're stuck because tough calls oftentimes leave you with unintended consequences. U.S.-Saudi Arabian relations, if they're not good, why? And if they are, why? Let me respond this way. I think that Saudi Arabia is outside of Morocco and outside of Tunisia, and actually inside of Morocco and Tunisia. Saudi Arabia is our longest, most predictable, proven ally in the entire grouping of Arab countries, the Middle East, and the Islamic world. I know that flies in the face of many people who look at it negatively, but you asked me the question, I gave you an answer there. I know many Americans say, well, look, it's all rather sultry and sordid and sultry, isn't it, in the sense that there's a contract between the two of us, and the contract is that They will guarantee that we will have access, unfettered access to their prodigious energy resources at secure supplies and manageable prices in exchange for our guarantee to defend them against any attack, intimidation, or invasion. And many people would nod their head and say, yeah, that's it. I find that insightful and true, but misleading and incomplete. And it's also rather debasing to both. It suggests that Saudi Arabia is something inanimate, a thing, and it does have a thing that is inanimate that the world needs. But to reduce it to just that and leave it at that is somewhat below the belt. And it also suggests that we couldn't have an interest or need or concern or be engaged or involved for any other reason than that, which is hardly the case. And the other side of the coin is that it makes them look like wimps or perpetual weak countries, which is the case that they are weak. And perhaps of the 212 countries, 185 of them would be wimps against a determined Iraq or a determined Iran. Name the number of countries that could hold their own against Iran or Iraq coming after them. So there's no really a shame or embarrassment there. In Europe in World War II, one country laid 19 others on their knees that were far more developed than those in the Middle East. And Asia did something pretty much similar. So there's a universality, ecumenical aspect of their situation. They are a humongous piece of real estate that has nothing itself to do with the oil and the energy aspect, although the oil and the energy is underneath the real estate. That is to say, Saudi Arabia is a continent more than a country. In terms of its sheer size, it is almost as big as all of Western Europe combined. And in 1967, in June, 8 Arab countries broke relations with us and withheld overflight rights. We were in Vietnam at the time, and we were told that if we flied over their countries, we would do so at a certain peril. We didn't test it. We went north through Central Asia, over Iran, south of the Sahara of Africa. It affected their decisiveness and dispatch, our credibility immensely, and there was a strategic mindset from then till now. We must never let that happen again. So its real estate is quite extraordinary there. It has 13 neighbors. We think we have 2. We have several more than 2. But it has 13 neighbors, and most of them are more populous, and virtually all of them are jealous and would like to trade places with it in a millisecond. Thirdly, it is part and parcel of the same thing that Israel is, and the Jerusalem question there, in the sense of it being part of, geographically, historically, chronologically, part of the crucible of culture, the cradle of civilization, the anvil of antiquity, the nursery of nations, the source of sunshine on the classical world, the birthplace of the 3 monotheistic faiths of humankind, and something more, namely the epicenter of prayer and pilgrimage, of faith and spiritual devotion to more than half of humanity. And it's also the headquarters of the fastest growing faith in the United States. You have a president now who has broken the fast with the Muslim community in the nation's capital. No American president has ever done that. You have a president who's spoken much more positively and knowledgeably about Islamic beliefs, practices, and institutions than all previous presidents combined. And then, to another degree, but it's because it's not publicized, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Abu Dhabi are the 3 most charitable, generous polities on the face of the earth. We think we are the most generous people in the world, but we're not. Neither in terms of the aggregate, although oftentimes we are with $13, $14 billion, but in terms of our economy, it's a pittance. Something like 0.1% of our budget goes to foreign economic assistance. With Saudi Arabia, with Kuwait, and Abu Dhabi, it's typically minimum of 3%, sometimes up to 6 or 7%. For the last 40 years, for which records have been kept, no countries have come close to those 3. In terms of charity or generosity per capita, we're 17th in the world. We think we're number 1, but we're 17th there. That's a little bit about Saudi Arabia. On 9/11, was there any relationship between it? I don't know. I've been perplexed and intrigued by that. Until we talk to the people who chose the date, I guess we won't know. But I would like to see the word 9/11 disabused, and it does have some practicality in terms of those in need, those in dire help, to please call it. And in terms of our relations with many of the countries in the region, we have asked them to dial 911 in the event that they should be invaded or intimidated. With regard to 25 years further down the road in terms of Jerusalem, another question here, would it be under Israeli control or Palestinian control? My answer would be it will be under shared control. It is a city that is like no other city, that tugs on people's heartstrings, emotions, and spiritual longings from one end of the planet to the other. To think that one of the three who hold it dear to their faith should have it to the comparative exclusion or diminution of the rights and legitimate interest of the other two is something I don't think will fly. It certainly hasn't flown so far. And it is against the spirit of the resolution in 1947 of November that called for a corpus separatum. And the fact that President Bush has said he envisages two states, an Israel and a Palestine, living side by side between secure and recognized borders, has the further echo of it that was to have been in Colin Powell's speech, but he took it out at the last minute, namely that Jerusalem will be the capital for both. I see it this way in my meetings with Sharon, with Arafat, with Vice President, and many of the people in this particular aspect of the conflict either explicitly or implicitly indicate that that's what they see as the end run as well there. How can we hope to proceed through a militaristic policy, through bombing and deployments, et cetera, without getting to the root causes of issues? I don't think we can succeed. But I can realize why some people do not want to see the causal issues addressed. There are many who favor the prolongation of the status quo. Just as the adage of the continuity of comfort is a seductive thing, so too is the perpetuation of power and prestige and privilege addictive. And there are many who would like to hold on to what they have despite the price, but the price is excessively high and has been so for a long time. And if one says, well, we can't let go now, it would reward terrorism, all hell would break out, it would reward the extremists, there would be a bloodbath. All of us have heard that before. When this country struggled to get its independence after 11 years of finding something rather unjust from 1765 to 1776, and we finally took up arms, and then 5 years later we did win our freedom. We would not have quit. We would not have stopped until we got our freedom. To think that the Palestinians will stop until they obtain their freedom and become an independent state like others in the region, I think is naive, irresponsible, and downright dangerous. Now, if you look at the century that went past, we heard all the same things in terms of Lisbon about the Portuguese not leaving Angola and Mozambique. In Seville or in Madrid against the Spanish not leaving the Philippines and the Caribbean. In Brussels against the Belgians not leaving the Congo, and the British not leaving Burma or Kenya or India, or France not leaving Algeria. Everyone did, and each is the better as a result. Very quickly after leaving, of course it was painful. Maybe people's political careers were ruined, but it's all in the rearview mirror. The relationship between Canada and Great Britain, between France and Germany, between Russia and Central Europe, has no patent on the process, no monopoly on the methodology, no trademark on the technique to arrive at a similar fair relationship between occupier and occupied. And I believe it's destined for the best of both. We will stand by Israel in this regard. Israel's existence is not at stake. What's at stake is to bring to an end a conflict that has robbed both peoples and scarred both people and denied both peoples of their peace and stability and security, and for a brighter future for the coming generations. With regard to Arab leaders have not supported the Palestinian cause, well, yes, they have, and yes, they haven't. There is the adage of we are our brother's keepers, but we're our brother's keepers closest to home. And I remember in '63 in Cairo, where Nasser thought, let's bring 3,000 here to sweep the streets. About 20,000 Egyptians went in the streets to say if there are any jobs to be had, they're for us first. We are here. You're responsible to us. I've seen others try the same thing and have it similarly boomerang. The one that did something different was King Hussein of Jordan. And nearly 2/3 of the Jordanian citizens today are Palestinian ancestry. Some refer to them as Jordastinians. And people thought, well, why don't the others do that? But something happened on August the 3rd and 4th and 5th of 1990 that told all the others we were right not to do it, because King Hussein was boxed in. He had no alternatives. He had been closer to us than any other head of state in the world up until then. And Jordan has yet to come back. He did what he had to do in order to survive, because 2/3 of his people had already demonstrated. So I think it's a more mixed record. In terms of the Intifada, this time around, Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi have taken some thousands of the wounded and injured into their hospitals. And I have talked with people who've gone in to try to cheer these young people up who've become unglued, thinking that they were strong and they would just go in and talk to this young girl or young boy, but they would see someone lying there paralyzed with a hole in their head or blind or missing a limb and realize that that could have been their own daughter or their own son. So emotional, spiritual, political, financial, humanitarian self-relief support has been about the nature of it thus far. But as I pointed out, no oil embargo since 1973, and no invasion or armed conflict as a result since then, except for the 2 intifadas, one of which we're still living with here. Sure, the last question was the occupied territory since 1967. Israel has sought numerous times to get Palestinians to negotiate a treaty to bring peace to the area. How is Israel to obtain peace if the Palestinians won't be forthcoming to its overtures? Excellent question. And this is what the peace process is all about, to try to get the two to come to terms. But from the Israeli side, we read, we understand that not until the violence ceases, until there has been an extended ceasefire, will we return to the negotiating table. From the Palestinian side, it is that, look, in 1993 at Oslo, where we really looked across the horizon and we saw it coming and we were dreaming our dreams, but throughout the period since then, our land continued to be taken. We were given no compensation. Our water continued to be exploited. Our people continued to be expelled. Our orchards, our vineyards, our farms continued to be bulldozed. Collective punishment continued to be levied on our villages and on our people there. All of this breaking our heart en route to breaking our back and our spirit. No, we will not reach out the hand and have a peace settlement while our land continues to be expropriated. Already we have made the historic sacrifice of 78% of the patrimony that was part of the land of the generation of this Palestinian generation's grandparents. We have 22% left, and this is what we have agreed to accept. You cannot demand that we yield still more land, still more resources, and have any chance of being a viable state.
Well, it's been a wonderful opportunity, that is to have another evening with John Duke Anthony. Extraordinarily informative.